Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome back to Guys That Magic. This is Hunter and David. Say what's up, David.
What's going on, guys?
We are back with another upgrade video. This time we are doing the $100 upgrade video to the Vampiric Bloodline pre-constructed commander deck that has come out with Innistrad Crimson Vow. Now, David has taken charge of upgrading this deck itself. So, without further ado, take it away, David, and tell us what direction you have taken Vampiric Bloodline and where your $100 is going to be spent.
All right. So Vampiric Bloodline, just go ahead and start it off. I'm going to go ahead and read the face card. So this is going to be the commander that we're building it around. I'm going to be building off just like the, principal face card from this. So that being Strefan, Mara, Progenitor. It is a black and a red for a legendary creature, Vampire Noble. It's a 3/2 with flying. It says, at the beginning of your end step, create a blood token for each player who lost life this turn. It also says whenever Strefan attacks, you may sacrifice 2 blood tokens. If you do, you may put a vampire card from your hand on the battlefield, tapped and attacking. It gains indestructible until end of turn. Now, I wanted to choose this one just because I felt like the other commander option in this deck was a little bit, I felt odd. So with these pre-constructed decks, we did get the option to have some partner commanders that we could goof around with. The partner commander pairing that comes inside this deck I thought was interesting because one of the 2 partners is actually not a vampire, and this deck is very vampire tribal. So I felt like, just generally, not to say that they weren't cool cards, but I definitely feel like Strefan is the direction you probably want to build in for this pre-constructed deck.
I gotcha.
So with that being said, just kind of looking through the deck, talking about some of its themes and some of its sub-themes to help get a direction in as far as how I wanted to move with this thing. The major theme here being vampire tribal. There are 2 creatures in this entire deck that are not vampires, which also part of the reason why I thought was so interesting that one of the other commander choices was one of those 2 creatures. As far as sub-theme goes, there's some mild madness, and there's some sacrifice themes. The sacrifice and the mild madness are both a little bit more on the subtle side here. It's much more of vampire tribal, but those sub-themes are present in the deck.
All right, so what were your first thoughts on the deck?
Generally speaking, I think that this deck, just kind of straight out of the box, is actually pretty well put together. Whenever I was going through the list of a lot of the creatures, a lot of the vampires specifically that are included in this, there are a lot of the vampires that I would pick up to upgrade this. So it actually made upgrading this or kind of choosing a direction to move in with this deck a little bit more challenging. But if anything, I mean, that's just a testament, and that speaks kindly to the fact that this is a pre-constructed deck. And I think that you're probably getting more bang for your buck with this than what you have with some of the other pre-constructed decks in the past. So that's a positive thing. It'll help save you some money and kind of already steers you with what it wants you to do.
Oh, totally. And as we know, this isn't the only vampire tribal deck they've made in the past, so I guess what sets this apart from the other ones?
All right, so this is where things actually get a little bit more tricky for me with Strefan. So the other 2 pre-constructed decks that we've had that are vampire-centric are for Edgar, the original Edgar, and then we also have the Anya, the original Anya, I guess now that both of which have received a reprint. The original Edgar is a Mardu card that is very vampire tribal. Obviously cares very much so about vampires. It's a great token maker, and then it also bumps your team. So with that being said, that's kind of like a go wide and then go big vampire deck. The other thing about this is that Edgar has what's called an eminence trigger on it, or an eminence ability on it. It's an ability that activates or you can utilize while the card is in the command zone. So I felt like these 2 cards kind of operated on different power levels, and it made upgrading this deck actually a little bit more challenging for me. I feel like in some ways, the original Edgar is actually just a better vampire tribal commander because it is more impactful and doesn't actually even need to be cast. In addition to that, Strefan likes to make these blood tokens, which we can sacrifice to then discard a card and draw a card. And that actually kind of feeds immediately back into Anya. Anya has the ability to tap to discard a card and then draw a card, and she utilizes the madness mechanic a little bit better than what Strephon does. So with that being said, I thought that this commander was really interesting because we want to care about vampires, we want to care about discard, but we've actually already gotten pre-constructed decks that do this or do those two exact same things. And I feel like they do those two things kind of better. What Strephon does do, though, that the other commanders that I've talked about don't do, is that he actually has the potential to make a lot of artifacts for you. He has the potential to make a lot of these blood tokens. So whenever it came to upgrading this deck and kind of focusing on what I wanted to do here, I did want to incorporate the amount of artifacts into this upgrade build. So just kind of giving you a heads up, this is still going to be a vampire tribal build. I'm still trying to utilize that, but I really want to be able to capitalize on making as many of those blood tokens as I possibly can. So that's really kind of what's going to set Strephon apart from the other two pre-constructed vampires.
Oh, definitely. There's some crazy ways to deal a lot of power with artifacts specifically, not necessarily ones, say, like treasure or any of the other ones, but I know a couple cards that deal some hefty power level with artifacts.
And we may see some of those in this upgrade. So some of the other things that I noticed about this upgrade, some of the things that I kind of just thought, or generally just looking over, I thought some areas that it needed to be improved in. One of the first ones is that ramp is very weak in this deck. Now, I understand that this is not a green deck, so we're not using Cultivate, we're not using Rampant Growth or any of the other cards you would commonly find in any of your green decks. But I did find it really interesting. There's not a whole lot of ramp in this deck, whether it be artifact ramp or whether it be maybe any of the rituals that we have access to in both red or in black. So I thought that was kind of interesting. We're also a little bit weaker whenever it comes to spot removal. The pre-constructed deck doesn't really come with a whole lot of interaction. Most of its interaction are not instant or sorceries. They're mainly stapled onto creatures. And as I found in this deck, a lot of the creatures that do interact with your opponent are pretty expensive. They're obviously meant to be cheated out with Strephon's ability.
Mm-hmm.
The last little kind of thing that I noticed with this is that the commander does need to be alive and in play in order for you to really be able to do anything with this deck, especially with us caring so much about those blood tokens, those artifacts that we're going to be producing. There's not really a whole lot of other cards in the deck that are really capable of capitalizing on those blood tokens, or at least capable of producing them in the same degree. So really important that you keep your commander up, you keep it alive, and that maybe you give your opponent some other things that they need to be killing.
I gotcha. So how do they balance all these themes?
So balancing these themes between madness, vampires, and then also the tokens that we have here. The sacrifice theme I've found to be a little bit on the weaker side. There's some interesting cards in here that I'm going to talk about that I just wasn't super sold on. I know that red black is fantastic whenever it comes to those aristocrat sacrifice based decks, but that's not really something that I feel like I want to be doing in this. Instead, I want to be focusing on those blood tokens. The other thing here is that the madness kind of sub package that goes along with this can definitely be super powerful, especially given the fact that the blood tokens give us the ability to discard those cards essentially whenever we need to. So I am going to be keeping the madness package, but I'm not really going to be adding to it.
Okay. So here we go. What is getting cut out of this deck?
So talking about that sacrifice sub-theme, the first card that I'm going to be removing from this is Blood Artist. Blood Artist for a 1 and a black is a creature vampire. It's a 0/1 that says whenever it or another creature dies, target opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. This card is basically an auto-include in any kind of aristocrats deck, but we don't have the ability to really capitalize on this. Yeah, it's going to be cool whenever our creatures die, we get a little bit of an added bonus, and this in and of itself is a vampire, but our deck really doesn't have a whole lot of ways for us to kind of exploit this card. Another one that we're going to be removing is a new card for this set, and this is Timothar, Baron of Bats. Timothar is 4 a black and a black for a 4/4 legendary creature vampire noble. It has Ward to discard a card. It says whenever another non-token vampire you control dies, you may pay 1 and exile it. If you do, create a 1/1 black bat creature token with flying. It gains when this creature deals combat damage to a player, sacrifice it, and return the exiled card to the battlefield tapped. So another way for us to be able to utilize the fact that our creatures would be dying, but we don't have any kind of consistent sack outlet. So this dude is really cool. It kind of helps to protect us from, I guess, some spot removal, or in the case that, I don't know, maybe our opponents go to board wipe or something like that. But I feel like these are really interesting, just not in this shell.
Yeah, those are very good cards, but I can see why you're taking them out if they don't work.
There are a couple other cards that I'm going to be removing from the deck because I feel like they care a lot about the commander that you have, and I just feel like they either kind of don't really work into the theme that we're going for, or maybe they're just not good cards. So the first one is Bloodsworn Steward. Bloodsworn Steward is 2 a red and a red for a creature vampire knight. It's a 4/4 with flying, and it says commander creatures you control have +2/+2 and have haste. I don't actually care if my commander has haste, nor do I really care about getting in for combat damage specifically with my commander. So this really doesn't do a whole lot for me here. Crimson Honor Guard is a reprint. This is 3 a red and a red for a creature vampire knight. It's a 4/5 with trample, and it says at the beginning of each player's end step, Crimson Honor Guard deals 4 damage to that player unless they control a commander. If this card was worded a little bit differently, I think it would be really cool for the deck. It's at the beginning of each player's end step, so it's not going to trigger on yours, which means if your opponents don't control their commanders, they're still going to take damage, but Strephon's actually not going to make blood tokens for you because he specifically cares about your end step. So the timing on this just feels weird and clunky. This is a card where I could just start dealing damage to myself. And if I am dealing damage to myself, it means I don't have my commander in play, so I'm still not making the blood tokens.
Yeah, that doesn't sound very good.
It's just it like on first glance, I can see why this card would want to be included, but it lacks some synergy that I do want to take advantage of. So the last card that I'm going to be talking about that cares a lot about the commander is Imposing Grandeur. This is 4 and a red for a sorcery. It says each player may discard their hand and draw cards equal to the greatest mana value of a commander they own on the battlefield or in the command zone. This is totally fine to help you be able to redraw some cards or to be able to take advantage of those madness effects. But your opponents are playing Magic too. And I never want to spend my turn allowing my opponents to draw cards, to sculpt their hand, or to feed their graveyard. And that's exactly what this card does. Also, what if my opponents are playing with another commander that maybe has even greater converted mana cost, or mana value, I'm sorry. So if they have a 6 mana commander, they could be getting even more of a benefit off this than me.
Never want to help your opponents.
Now, the next category that I'm looking at for this deck is in the area of card draw. I do think that the card draw in this deck is kind of interesting because our commander actually does a wonderful job of being able to filter and to help sculpt our hand, given that we're not actually going to have additional cards into our hand whenever we're using those blood tokens, but it gives you something to do with the land that you drew that you just don't need because it's turn 8 or something that you just maybe don't have access, or maybe you don't have a use for it. So the first card here is Anya's Ravager. This one is 2 and a red for a creature vampire berserker. It's a 3/3 that says it attacks each combat if able, and whenever it attacks, discard your hand, then draw 3 cards. It has madness of 1 and a red. I'm keeping most of the madness cards in here, and I do like the madness like sub-package, sub-theme. I really don't want to be forced to attack in with a creature, especially given that this thing is only a 3/3 and doesn't have any evasion. And I have to discard my hand. So there's going to be some situations where I'm just tossing cards that I would rather keep. That maybe I use some of those blood tokens to help sculpt my hand, and then my hand goes away. So I'm not the biggest fan of this card. Damnable Pact is another one that I think we could probably do without. It is X, a black and a black for a sorcery. It says target player draws X cards and loses X life. You will always be that target player for this card, at least in this deck. If you can make infinite mana in another deck, then sure that you can go ahead and you can use this to kill off an opponent. But realistically, you're never using this as a burn spell. This is just a draw spell that's going to hurt you a bit. I think we could do better than this. I don't really want to be paying, say, 7 mana at sorcery speed to draw 5 cards and hurt myself for 5. The last card here that I'm going to be removing is Underworld Connections. I really don't like this card. I think that this is a trap card that is very. It looks really good on the surface for newer players, but whenever you start to play around with it, you start to realize that, wait a second, this thing is actually really bad. So it's a black and a black for an enchantment aura. It says enchant land. Enchanted land has tap, pay 1 life, draw a card. So for 3 mana, you get an enchantment that is going to tax you and hurt you, probably for the rest of the time that this thing is in play. Because if you're tapping the land to be able to draw the card, you're not tapping it for mana anymore.
Yeah.
I mean, ultimately, I look at it like this. On its first activation, it's kind of like you had to pay 4 mana to draw 1 card. And I know that this is an engine, but that is just an atrocious rate.
I completely agree.
Some of the other cards that we have in here that I'm going to be gutting don't really fit into our strategy, or maybe they're just not all that well supported. The first one is going to be probably one of the really more interesting cards that I came across in this deck, and one that I could totally see having a home, but just maybe not in the shell that I'm trying to go with. This one being Arterial Alchemy. This is 2 and a red for an enchantment. It says whenever it enters the battlefield, create a blood token for each opponent you have. Blood tokens you control are equipment in addition to their other types, and have equipped creature gets +2/+0 and equip 2. I think this is a really dope card, considering we should be able to pretty consistently be able to create at least 1, 2, maybe 3 or 4 blood tokens a turn. So that's a lot of equipment, but I don't really want to be pushing for having equipment that I'm going to then have to spend all of my mana to dump into to just like make my creatures a little bit bigger. The next card that I'm going to be gutting is Lauren the Diversion. This is 2 and a red for a legendary creature. It's a human rogue for a 3/3. It says partner with Camber the Plunderer. So if you're unfamiliar with the way that that works, you can have either both of them be your commander, or if they are part of the 99, it says when this creature enters the battlefield, target player may put Camber into their hand from their library, then shuffle. This 3/3 has first strike. It also has pay 2 mana, sacrifice an artifact or creature, and goad target creature. That means that until your next turn, that creature attacks each combat if able, and attacks a player other than you if able. It gives us that sack outlet, but it's not a vampire. And it's not really doing a whole lot. I understand that the goad aspect of things gives us the ability to kind of push that damage through. But there are a couple of cards that we're going to run into, specifically some of our removal package, that I don't really think this card fits in all that well. And ultimately, I'm just not super impressed with this. I think there are more efficient ways for us to be able to make those blood tokens.
Yeah, I see why you've gutted it. I mean, especially since it's not a vampire. But what about the partner, Camblar or Camber?
Camber the Plunderer was quite a bit of a blunderer. So this card, whenever it was originally spoiled, had a little bit of different wording on it, which got a lot of people very excited. And then we discovered that the wording that was on the image originally released was actually not the wording of the actual card.
Wait, what? Are you telling me that Wizards messed up?
Oh, dude, they never do that.
Oh,
Never,
okay,
ever,
good.
ever. Yeah,
Good,
their
good, good,
quality
good.
control is excellent.
Whew. You had me worried for a second. So tell me about this card that they got wrong.
So for 3 and a black, so it's a legendary creature, Vampire Rogue. It's a 3/4 with partner with Lorraine or Loren. I'm horrible with names, so I apologize. It's got lifelink, and it says whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, you gain 1 life and create a blood token. The original image for this card said whenever a creature dies, which means that you could have been able to take advantage of your own creatures dying and kind of use this actually as an aristocrat space commander, but with it only caring about your opponent's creatures, it severely limits what you can do with this card. Essentially, it's a way to make blood tokens
Yeah, you can't really go
occasionally.
infinite with your opponent's things.
I don't even need to go infinite. I just look at it like our commander can easily make 3 or 4 a turn. This might make 1, 2 on a board wipe. Maybe it's good.
And then it kills itself.
Well, yeah. So sadly, we're going to get rid of both of the partner commanders. These next couple cards that are going to be gutting from the deck, I just felt like they just didn't quite make sense being in here. So the first one is Sinister Waltz. This is 3 a black and a red for a sorcery. It says choose 3 target creature cards in your graveyard, return 2 of them at random to the battlefield, and put the other on the bottom of your library. I don't like random. I don't like chaos unless your opponents are being suckered into it as well. This is a card that is really powerful if you have a very small graveyard. And if you have a very small graveyard, you're probably not utilizing those blood tokens. This gets worse the longer the game goes on, the more cards you have in there. Because, I mean, at a certain point, you're going to start filtering out maybe some of the small or not quite as impactful creatures that are in the deck. And your likelihood of pulling one of those from the random, I guess, would increase. I don't know. You do get to choose 3, and then you're going to randomly pick 2 from those 3. So maybe I'm being too critical on this card. But I still don't like the random factor. I also don't like the fact that this card costs 5 mana for a sorcery. I just feel like that is a lot. Mob Rule is 4 a red and a red for a sorcery. It says choose 1. Gain control of all creatures with power 4 or greater until end of turn. Untap those creatures. They gain haste until end of turn. Or gain control of all creatures with power 3 or less until end of turn. Untap those creatures. They gain haste until end of turn. If you were to ever cast this spell, you would use whichever one of these 2 you feel like is going to be most relevant to the current board state. And I think that this card could be absolutely fantastic if you actually did have those sacrifice engines inside the deck. That way you could steal a bunch of your opponent's creatures and then be able to sacrifice them away for some kind of additional value so that your opponents don't get them back. But we don't have that in this deck. So this is kind of just a way for us to be able to push combat damage through for a turn. And even at that, we're not taking all of the creatures, which means we're probably not taking all of the blockers. I just don't. I'm not very high on this card. The last card in here is Vampiric Dragon. Vampiric Dragon is 6 a black and a red for a total of 8 mana. It's a 5/5 with flying. It says, whenever a creature dealt damage by Vampiric Dragon dies this turn, put a +1/+1 counter on Vampiric Dragon. You can pay 1 and a red to have it deal 1 damage to target creature. It's a big, super expensive vampire that has the ability to grow. And that's cool. I really don't want to spend 8 mana on a creature that is just big. And I get that, yes, this is a target for you to be able to cheat out using Strafon's ability. There are just cooler things we can be doing. So, no.
It is very expensive.
Like, if you're not cheating this out, you're just not getting to play with it. 8 mana is an insane amount for a creature.
Very true. So do you have anything else you're going to remove?
I do. We're going to remove a lot of the removal package in this deck. I
Remove
went a
some
little
removal.
Yeah, the removal package in this deck is really interesting. So Black in Commander actually has some solid options, albeit I will admit I don't think it's the best color for removal, and I don't think that red-black is the best color pairing for it, but some of these cards are just outright bad. The first one is Urge to Feed. This is a black and a black for an instant. It says target creature gets -3/-3 until end of turn. You may tap any number of vampire creatures you control. If you do, put a +1/+1 counter on each of those vampires. This benefit's going wide, and that it's going to pump your team, but the -3/-3 is not what you want to see whenever you have to kill an opponent's commander that is a 4/4 or bigger, or any kind of big threat. Similarly, I have issue with another card, and this one being Avacyn's Judgment. Avacyn's Judgment is 1 and a red for a sorcery. It's got a madness of X and a red, and it says Avacyn's Judgment deals 2 damage divided as you choose among any number of targets. If the spell's madness cost was paid, it deals X damage divided as you choose amongst those permanents and or players instead. This is a madness payoff card if we have a ton of mana to be able to sink into it. I've never really been super high on these kind of effects, these like red sun zenith, pay 1,000,000 mana to try and hit something really hard kind of spells. Just like, I don't know, I feel like if you want them to be relevant, you have to sink a ton of mana into them. And the base of this one being 2 mana to hit for 2 is not good.
Doesn't sound very good.
Midnight Arsonist is another card that we're going to end up removing here. This is a 3 and a red for a creature vampire. It's a 3/2 that states, whenever it enters the battlefield, destroy up to X target artifacts without mana abilities, where X is the number of vampires you control. This card might totally be fine in a different kind of build, but I am imagining if you're picking up a pre-constructed deck, you're probably going to be playing with other people who maybe also just picked up a pre-constructed deck. And most of those artifacts either tap to make mana, which means that they're not being destroyed by this, or you might not care about them. I get it. It's a vampire that has removal attached to it. So I see the synergies here. I just don't think you're really going to have a whole lot of targets. I feel like for the most part, this is just going to be a card that hangs around in your hand that you want to be able to take advantage of, but kind of don't. Unstable Obelisk is another card that we're going to be removing from this. This is 3 mana for an artifact. Tap to add 1 colorless to your, or tap to add 1 colorless, and then you could pay 7, tap it, sacrifice it, and destroy target permanent. So it's got some upside there, but once again, 7 mana is a lot, and I really don't like my artifact ramp coming in at 3 mana either, especially if it's tapping for only a single colorless mana.
Yeah, that second ability is expensive.
And the final card that we're going to be removing from this deck is Shadow Grange Arcfiend. This is 6 and a black for a creature demon. This is the other non-vampire creature. It's an 8/4, and it says, whenever it enters the battlefield, each opponent sacrifices a creature with the greatest power among creatures they control. You gain life equal to the greatest power among creatures sacrificed this way. And it's got a madness of 3 and a black. So I do see the upside. You could potentially get this thing out very quickly, and at that point, it's an 8/4. But aside from having a lot of power, it doesn't really do much. It's probably not going to survive very long with it only having 4 toughness, and even if it does, probably going to be jump block. Plus, I see that the sacrifice ability on it is some cool upside. I just think that it's not really anything super impactful. If you want to be playing around with these kind of sacrifice effects, there are significantly better, cheaper, and more consistent routes for you to go. Oh, and I forgot to include on this too, if you do madness it, you also have to pay 8 life. So it's like this thing hits you too.
That's painful.
So those are all of the cards that we are going to be removing from this. So in total, in case you weren't keeping track, that's 19 cards that we have removed from this pre-constructed deck.
All right. So from those 19 cards that you have removed, what are 19 cards that you have decided to put in their place?
All right, so I did want to put some vampires back into the deck, considering we just removed quite a few of them. And some of the vampires that I wanted to put in not only synergize with the deck because of the fact that they are vampires, but just kind of for flavor purposes, I feel like they should probably go along with this deck as well. So the first one that I'm going to talk about is Olivia Crimson Bride, coming from the same set, or I'm sorry, coming from Crimson Vow, the standard set that goes along with it. This card is 4 a black and a red for a legendary creature, Vampire Noble. It's a 3/4 with flying and haste. It says whenever it attacks, return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped and attacking. It gains when you don't control a legendary vampire, exile this creature. So this kind of works twofold in that with Olivia being in the deck, we get to utilize some of the vampires that have already died or we've discarded with the madness effect. I'm sorry, with the blood token effect. And this now means that we're running, I guess in this case, 2 legendary creatures or 2 legendary vampires to help make sure that whatever we're reanimating is going to stick around. So we'll have both this and then hopefully our commander in play as well. Similarly, I'm also looking to put Olivia Voldaren in. This is 2 a black and a red for a legendary creature vampire. This time around, she's a 3/3 with flying. You can pay 1 and a red to have her deal 1 damage to another target creature. That creature becomes a vampire in addition to its other types. Put a +1/+1 counter on Olivia Voldaren. And you can pay 3 a black and a black to gain control of target vampire for as long as you control Olivia Voldaren. So not quite straight, like kind of strict removal for us, but this is a way for us to be able to remove some of those pesky creatures that our opponents may have by just gaining control of them. She also has an outlet in which we could potentially end up dealing some damage to, or potentially killing some of our smaller opponents' creatures. So it is something we can do there. Basically, what I'm looking at with this is a way for us to kind of minimize the number of blockers our opponents have. And then also, this in and of itself being a large creature with flying, hopefully is going to be able to get in for some damage and help us make more of those blood tokens. The next card that I want to include here is Twilight Prophet. Twilight Prophet is probably the best vampire I could come up with for EDH. This is 2 a black and a black for a creature vampire cleric. It is a 2/4 with flying and ascend. Ascend says if you control 10 or more permanents, you get the city's blessing for the rest of the game. This is going to be very, very easy for us to be able to turn on, considering our commander is making multiple of those blood tokens, so long as things are going well. So I can see this coming into play and probably immediately having the city's blessing. It says at the beginning of your upkeep, if you have the city's blessing, reveal the top card of your library and put it into your hand. Each opponent loses X life and you gain X life, where X is that card's converted mana cost. So this is a card that draws us additional cards, and we have quite a few expensive targets in here in this deck because many of our vampires we can cheat into play using Straphan's ability. And if we do have the city's blessing, that card draw also hurts our opponents and gains us some life, which means we're going to be making 3 more blood tokens because Twilight Prophet hurt them. Their life total dropped. So a little bit of life gain, a little bit of card draw, and synergizes with our commander. Absolutely fantastic card here.
So a couple of Olivias and Twilight Prophet seems really good, making all the blood tokens being permanent and all.
Oh, absolutely. I think that those 3 are really powerful. I did want to go off and include more vampires into this build, and we're going to go through the rest of the upgrades and some of the other cards that I want to include in here too. But to be honest, I felt like this deck actually comes with a lot of very good vampires. A lot of the cards that I wanted to include, I found are actually already part of the 99 for the constructed deck. So awesome with that. To help us be able to maximize the damage that we are dealing, to make sure that we are creating as many of those blood tokens as possible, I'm going to throw in 6 cards as part of a, like, let's just consistently hurt people package.
Okay.
So the first one of these is Court of Ire. Court of Ire is an enchantment that costs 3, a red, and a red. It says whenever it enters the battlefield, you become the monarch. It also says at the beginning of your upkeep, Court of Ire deals 2 damage to any target. If you're the monarch, it deals 7 damage to that player or permanent instead. So this is a way for us to be able to at least make a blood token. And since it introduces the monarch mechanic into the game, at a very bare minimum, you'll draw a card at the beginning of your end step. So you'll be able to cantrip off of this. And if you can push in for combat damage to be able to take the crown back or take the monarchy back from whichever opponent may have grabbed it from you, you can continue to draw additional cards. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with the monarch mechanic, is so long as you are the monarch at the beginning of your end step, you'll draw a card. And if somebody deals combat damage to the monarch, they become the monarch. So it encourages that combat damage. We're also including Court of Ambition in here. This is 2, a black and a black. It says whenever it enters the battlefield, you become the monarch. So same kind of ability. It also says at the beginning of your upkeep, each opponent loses 3 life unless they discard a card. If you're the monarch, instead, each opponent loses 6 life unless they discard 2 cards. Ultimately, what we're looking at with this card is we're either forcing our opponents to discard cards, or they're losing life, which will help make more of those blood tokens for us. Retreat to Hagra is a 3 and a black for an enchantment. This has landfall, and it says whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, choose 1. Target creature gets +1/+0 and gains death touch until end of turn. So maybe be able to help us get in for some combat damage because nobody wants to block a death toucher. Or each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. I know that doesn't sound like much, but essentially that second mode says play a land, and at the beginning of your end step, you'll make 3 more blood tokens. We have some small creatures as a part of this package that are designed to get in play early, to start pinging people, and then also hopefully to make some of those blood tokens as well. And I do apologize, they're not vampires. The first one is Spear Spewer. For a single red mana, you get a creature, Goblin Warrior. It's a 0/2 with Defender. But it says tap it, Spear Spewer deals 1 damage to each player. So you are included in this, but that's totally fine because Strephon actually will give you a 4th blood token if you can hurt yourself too. So Spear Spewer, a 1 mana card that has the potential to make 4 blood tokens per turn for you. Thermo Alchemist is fairly similar here. This one is 1 and a red for a 0/3. It's a creature human shaman, also with Defender. You can tap it and deals 1 damage to each opponent, so it's not going to hurt you. But it says whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, untap Thermo Alchemist. This isn't going to be a deck that's probably going to be chaining a whole lot of instants and sorceries together, so realistically speaking, you're not going to be tapping and untapping this thing a lot. But being able to tap this creature and not have to sink any mana into it to know that you're going to be able to get those 3 blood tokens off of Strephon is absolutely wonderful. All of these cards that I mentioned so far are engines that once they're in play, you don't have to continue to put mana into to just make your deck work. The last one here is probably my favorite because this thing is absolutely insane with how it synergizes. So this one is Gear per Aether Grid. It is 2 and a red for an enchantment. It says tap 2 untapped artifacts you control. Gear per Aether Grid deals 1 damage to target creature or player. This gives you the ability to tap blood tokens to ping an opponent to make more blood tokens. So once you hit that critical mass, if you are reaching some large number, say for example, based off of all of these individual little effects and pingers and combat damage, I can imagine you having 20, 25, or potentially even more blood tokens, assuming that you're not burning through them at some kind of cyclic rate. Which means Gear per Aether Grid has the potential to start nuking your opponent's life totals whenever you need it to, so you can specifically target them, or so long as you have enough blood tokens, you can tap them, hurt your opponent, and make more blood tokens. This thing gets out of control really, really quickly. So that last card, Gear per Aether Grid, is actually going to lead us over into the next package that I wanted to include, and this is capitalizing on the fact that we're going to hopefully have a ton of artifacts in play. The first one in here is Marionette Master, this also being, sadly, not a vampire. It is for a black and a black for a 1/3. It's a creature human artificer. It has Fabricate 3, which means whenever this creature enters the battlefield, put 3+1/+1 counters on it, or create 3 1/1 colorless servo artifact creature tokens. You're probably putting the counters on this. It also says whenever an artifact you control is put into the graveyard from the battlefield, target opponent loses life equal to Marionette Master's power. If you put the counters on this and you tap and sack a blood token, this is going to hit for 4. This is very quickly reaching the realm where you don't need the blood tokens to start making more blood tokens. You're using these blood tokens to just outright kill somebody at this point. Hellkite Tyrant is one of the kind of like pseudo alternate win conditions in this deck. This is for a red and a red for a creature dragon. It's a 6/5 with flying and trample. And it says whenever it deals damage to a player, gain control of all artifacts that player controls. At the beginning of your upkeep, if you control 20 or more artifacts, you win the game. So all of those blood tokens are going to start counting into this. Plus, this has the ability to potentially steal our opponent's artifacts as well. And it's a 6/5 with flying and trample. This is going to be able to find somebody to bully to make those extra blood tokens with as well. The last card in this package is Disciple of the Vault. This is a single black mana for a creature human cleric. It's a 1/1. And it says whenever an artifact is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, you may have target opponent lose 1 life. So this is kind of similar to Marionette Master in that we're now going to be hurting our opponents whenever we're tapping and sacking those blood tokens. It's not quite as effective, but if you have enough of them in play, you can really start to hurt your opponents. I wanted to include these creatures given that I know they're not vampires, and I know that people are probably going to give us some flack on this because I'm including a lot of non-vampire creatures into this deck, and Strephon does want that vampire tribal so that he can cheat creatures into play. What I'm really trying to do here, though, is capitalize off of those blood tokens specifically, help us to amass a large amount of them, and if we do have the ability to start cheating them, or to start cheating some vampires into play using those blood tokens, there are still plenty of vampires in this deck. I know that it probably doesn't sound like that with how many that I have taken out, but I promise you, you're still going to pretty consistently have the option to cheat an additional creature into play. The last couple of cards that I wanted to talk about, I felt this kind of they fell into a couple of different categories that I felt like the deck was maybe weak in. The first one that I'm going to talk about here is Infernal Grasp. It's 1 and a black for an instant. It says destroy target creature, you lose 2 life. The losing 2 life thing doesn't matter. You start off the game with 40 in EDH. That's irrelevant. Being able to destroy a creature at instant speed is pretty much a necessity. I think that you should be running some kind of removal package. There is stuff in the deck that deals with our opponent's creatures. Most of them, however, are not going to be coming down at instant speed. So I did want to at least include this. And realistically speaking, if you did want to go heavier on a discard pack, or I'm sorry, on a removal package that wasn't quite as creature focused, because this deck is, you may want to include some more removal in here. This is just a single card that I'm going to throw in. There is a card that I thought might be pretty fun. We're still running a very large number of vampires in this deck, and with the blood tokens, we have the ability to discard a lot of those cards. So this card is Patriarch's Bidding. It is 3 a black and a black for a sorcery. It says each player chooses a creature type. Each player returns all creature cards of a type chosen this way from their graveyard to the battlefield. So if we are digging through our deck quickly, or if our opponent just board wiped us, this is a great way for us to be able to get all of those vampires back. It is super important, however, that you pay close attention to what your opponents are playing. If they are playing a tribal deck, which they very well could be if they're picking up some of the other precons that go along with this, I would strongly encourage not to actually include this card. I think that this is a card that fits really well in with the tribal package, because if we are the only tribal deck, we're going to be able to recur hopefully most of the creatures that are in our graveyard, and our opponents may get 1 or 2 creatures back, but we would really be able to capitalize on it. So this is a card that's very, very situational, but it does kind of give us that recursion, or at least mass recursion, in case something goes wrong, or we decide, you know what, we just need to dig through our deck as fast as we can.
Playing with fire. I love it. What else do we
100%
got?
playing with fire. All right, the last category for this is ramp. As I mentioned before in this video, ramp in this deck is a bit on the weak side. So the first 2 cards I'm going to include in here, I think honestly, I would probably include these 2 or the equivalent of these 2 in just about every single EDH deck. The first one is Talisman of Indulgence, and there's a whole cycle of these cards. That's why I mentioned my previous comment. It's 2 colorless mana for an artifact. You can tap it to add 1 colorless mana to your, or you can tap to add 1 colorless mana, or you can tap it, in this case, to add a black or a red, and it deals 1 damage to you. 2 mana ramp for artifacts is really where I want to be at, unless there is some kind of crazy additional upside that goes along with it. It taps for both of our colors, and later on in the game, whenever we don't need it to tap for a black or a red, we don't have to have it tap for a black and a red. It doesn't always have to hurt you. Also, Felwar Stone. Felwar Stone is 2 mana for an artifact. It says tap to add to your mana pool 1 mana of any color that a land an opponent controls could produce, even though we are playing just a black-red deck. I feel like this is going to be able to tap for those colors more often than what you might think. Even in the case that your opponents are just running like a 2-color deck, and say, for example, they're even running a 2-color deck that doesn't have black or red in it, they're still going to be running lands that have the ability to tap for any color. So I still think that, yes, there are going to be a lot of situations where Felwar Stone is really powerful. We'll be able to tap for our colors more often than what I think most people probably think. And even in the case that we don't need to, if we do have to tap and make a color that maybe our deck really doesn't utilize, say, for example, we're tapping it for a white, that still adds to the amount of mana that we're capable of making in a given turn. So it still helps to ramp us. So the next card that we're going to talk about is Bantu's Monument. This is 3 mana for a legendary artifact. It says black creature spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. Well, that's wonderful, because that's most of our creatures. It also says whenever you cast a creature spell, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life, which is also wonderful because now it feeds into our commander. It drains our opponent a little bit there. That way we can make more blood tokens.
That sounds perfect.
This is what I want my 3 mana artifact ramp to do. It could potentially save me on 2 or 3 or 4 mana per turn, given how many creatures I end up wanting to cast, and it synergizes with what our game plan is. I also have Herald's Horn included in the deck. This is 3 mana for an artifact. It says whenever it enters the battlefield, choose a creature type. You're going to choose vampires. I know that we've included some non-vampires on the deck. The vast majority of the creatures in this deck are still vampires. You're still choosing vampires. It says creature spells you cast of the chosen type cost 1 less to cast. And at the beginning of your upkeep, look at the top card of your library. If it's a creature card of the chosen type, you may reveal it and put it into your hand. So it gives us a little bit of like pseudo card draw in the case, or pseudo card draw. And it also helps us to be able to cast, hopefully, more creature spells because it's doing the ramp. There's not really a whole lot of ways for us to be able to set up the top card of our library. We can draw and discard using the blood tokens, but that still doesn't provide information as to what the top card of the deck is. So Herald's Horn, still a really nice utility card to have in here. However, I will admit, without something like Sensei's Divining Top or some other kind of card that really stacks the top card of the library, we're not maximizing this card. Okay, and then the last card that I wanted to include in here, and bear with me for a little bit because I know that this is going to be very, very confusing. This is Braid of Fire. This is 1 and a red for an enchantment. It says cumulative upkeep. Add a red to your mana pool. In parentheses, it says at the beginning of your upkeep, put an age counter on this permanent. then sacrifice it unless you pay its upkeep cost for each age counter on it. So the way that this is going to work is at the beginning of your upkeep, you're going to put an age counter on it, and it will add 1 red mana equal to the amount of age counters on it. So it'll add 1, and then on the next turn it'll add 2, and then 3 and 4, and so forth and so on. The cost that it wants you to pay is actually adding that red to your mana pool. And I know that that sounds weird. The reason why this card exists is because a long time ago, Magic used to have a ruling called mana burn, or something called mana burn. Essentially, what would end up happening is if you had unspent mana left in your mana pool and you ended your turn with it, you would actually be penalized and you would lose life equal to the amount of unspent mana you had. So the way that this card was originally intended to be used was that you would end up eventually reaching a point where you had too much mana left over and you couldn't spend it, and then you would end up losing life because of that mana. Since that ruling no longer exists, mana burn is not a thing anymore, you can end your turn and not have spent the mana that this card would have made, and it doesn't hurt you. So this card actually doesn't have a downside anymore because of the way that we've just changed the rules of Magic. Essentially, what you're going to do is you'll play this for 2 mana at the beginning of your next turn. You'll add 1 red mana. At the beginning of the turn after that, you'll add 2, and then 3, and 4, and so forth and so on. So this card is actually going to scale, and it's going to reach a point where it is ramping you out of control.
I'm going to be honest. I've never heard this card, and that is absolutely bonkers. What a find.
It's a really old card. It's a very complicated card that I don't think a lot of newer players really understand. I don't think a lot of more experienced players still completely understand this card because this card is weird and interacts in a way that there's a rule that used to exist that no longer exists that makes this card just strange.
Yeah, it even says I'm looking at Wizard's actual site that says the rulings of this card, very unusual card. Add a red is a cost. This enchantment does nothing but add increasing amounts of mana to your mana pool during your upkeep. That's wild.
Yep. The only downside really of this card is that if you top deck it later on in the game, it sucks, but most ramp and mana rocks kind of suck later on. And if you don't need this card later, use a blood token, pitch it, and hopefully draw something better.
Very true. So, I think that's 19 cards that you've added into this.
That is 19 cards that we have added into it. And in total, if you were looking to go pick this up or make these changes, it would come out to about $95 off of TCG Player. And that's assuming that we're using the TCG Player market price pricing. You might be able to find these cards for a little bit cheaper. It might be a little bit more expensive. And then, of course, that cost is also not taking into consideration any tax or any kind of like shipping fees that may be associated with it.
So you're saving people money if they were going out with $100. Well done, David.
So all in all, super curious. I would love to hear what you guys have to say about this. You can take this deck, I feel like, in a different direction entirely than what I wanted to, or entirely than what I did go in. So let us know if you're more of a fan of maybe the vampire tribal aspect of things. If you did like the artifact build, maybe if you wanted to do some more madness stuff, because I know that you could go in that direction as well. Or maybe if you found a creative way to utilize this commander that we didn't think of. One final little tidbit here is, in the case you were trying to check it out and look at the overall deck list to see all of the cards are going to be included in this build, we are going to link the description. I'm sorry, we are going to link the deck list down in the description below, so you can go check it out there.
Absolutely. And of course, we will be doing our $300 upgrade video. David, you getting ready for that?
Getting ready for it.
Getting ready for it. You'll see that shortly, hopefully. You'll also see the upgrade to the Spirit Squadron deck. Again, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Like this video, comment down below if you like these changes. What would you do differently? Go follow us on our Twitter and our Instagram. That's @GuysThatMagic. And until next time, this is Guys That Magic. Hope you guys have a great rest of your day. Peace.
Later.